All right, guys, welcome to part 2 of today's lecture on education inequality. In part 1, we thought a little bit about what education looks like in this country today, how it produces inequality, sort of what that inequality looks like. And in this section, we're going to move on to thinking about what are the roots of that inequality. And we're going to start by thinking about what's happening outside of schools, actually. What is producing inequality before kids even enter a school, sometimes even at kindergarten, okay? Okay, so often when we're thinking about inequality and education reform, we're kind of hyper-focused on what's happening within schools, what's happening with school staff, and we're often not thinking about the role of parents and parenting in education. Kids spend most of their time actually outside of schools. The typical 18-year-old is only going to spend around 13% of their waking hours in schools. Okay, so it's important for us to think about what's not only happening at their time in the classroom, but also how what's happening outside of schools is contributing to their education or to their success or to their detriment. Teachers, if you ask them, are really aware of the role of parenting in education, right? I have an aunt who's a public elementary school teacher, and she often talks about how parents are sometimes a detriment to their child's education, either because they're not helping their kids with their homework as they should be, or they didn't check to see if the kid had done it correctly. If they don't communicate with the teacher well, right? They're not asking for what they need, or they're being overly demanding or hard on their child, right? There's lots of reasons parents can kind of aggravate teachers, but the point is that if you ask teachers, they're really aware of the role that parents play and how they can lead to their child's success, or it can kind of be a detriment to their child's education. Parents' engagement with their children's education matters quite a lot, right? What we know from repeated research is that parents who read out loud to their kids every day are much more likely to have the kids go to college. In fact, 71% of people with a college degree had parents who read out loud to them as children, right? So there's things that parents can do outside the classroom to reinforce those cognitive skills and to sort of help their child learn, okay? Parents can do other things as well, right? They help with their homework. When kids are outside of school, they can help reinforce school rules and concepts, right? Like as little kids, you learn how to say please and thank you in the classroom, sort of reinforcing that as well. Parents can provide a safe and stable place for their kids to study, right? Lots of people probably take it for granted that as growing up, they had a table to do their homework at, or they had a home environment that felt comfortable and where they were fed well and things were kind of emotionally stable around them so that they could learn, right, and that they could do their homework. Do you have parents, right, who attended to your medical needs or maybe even your mental needs, your cognitive needs, right? If you're a child with ADHD or dyslexia, do you have parents who are catching that, right? And that would have a big effect on your learning and experience in the classroom as well. Now, this is not to say that like it's individual parents' fault if their kids are not succeeding in school, right? It's really easy to slip into the narrative of if only parents cared more, then their kids would be successful, right? They would help their kids. There wouldn't be inequality. But it's not that simple, right? And we know as sociologists that's not really going to be our take today in how we talk about parenting and the role of education. We know that as sociologists, right, we need to pay attention to the broader patterns of why certain parents parent a certain way, right, versus other parents. And how those patterns are conditioned by different social forces. Okay, so as we're going to talk about today, this is correlated with social class and socioeconomic status, right? But that's not to say that parents of a low SES don't care about their child's education, right? Actually, it's quite the opposite. Most low SES parents say it's extremely important for their child to go to college and to get an education so they have opportunities, okay? So there's something else happening that's maybe patterning, creating a pattern between social class and parenting choices and how that is going to later impact their children in the classroom. So this is about the point where we're going to go back to thinking about Annette Lareau, who we previously spoke about in her book Unequal Childhoods. Okay, Annette Lareau is very broadly in this book correlating economic class with cultural and social behaviors, essentially saying like the social class that we're in causes us to behave differently in the social world. So we spoke a little bit about this in terms of health inequality and how our behavior in doctors' offices, for example, is patterned by social class. That upper class kids are more likely to take initiative, to take control, to engage with authoritative figures like doctors, versus lower class kids who are more likely to let authoritative figures take the lead and kind of take a backseat in those situations. We talked about how this could lead to health inequality because upper class kids are more likely to advocate for themselves in those contexts, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so she's really interested in these unequal child rearing practices, how parenting is conditioned by social class. Okay, and what she finds is that there's two types of parenting styles. The first is called concerted cultivation, which is correlated with high SES parents, and natural growth parenting, which is associated with low SES parenting. Okay, and as we talked about, has huge consequences because it transmits different advantages to children, right? That concerted cultivation children are getting a leg up because of what their parents are teaching them and how they're teaching them to engage in the social world. Okay, and I will also say, she makes these conclusions through ethnography. So she actually got permission to follow some families around of different class backgrounds, and she just kind of followed them wherever they went and made observations about how they were parenting their kids. It's kind of an interesting method. The book is kind of interesting to read because of that. Okay, so let's look at some examples of the differences in these parenting styles. I'm gonna move myself so you guys can see. There we go. Okay, so we have this table here that's going to show us the differences between the concerted cultivation method and the natural growth method. What we see, of course, is that for the concerted cultivation side, parents are actively fostering and assessing child's talents, opinions, and skills. So they're kind of taking stock of what their kids are good at and trying to like nurture that. So for example, parents who follow this method would probably have their kids on a lot of after school activities, right? If they notice their child is musical, like, well, let's get you started playing piano or like violin, or if you're athletic, like, let's get you into different sports to try and cultivate that. The natural growth parents, on the other hand, kind of allow children to grow naturally, right? Rather than rigidly structuring their lives and trying to produce certain outcomes, they're letting their child kind of do what they want to do, right? And if that means them coming home at the end of the day and kind of just playing with their friends outside rather than going to lots of different activities, then that's what they'll do, okay? Language also plays a role here, right? Parents in the concerted cultivation column are teaching children to reason, to use directives, okay, to engage with what adults are telling them and maybe even contest that sometimes. And we often see kids who are high SES negotiating with their parents, right? If their parents are saying, only 5 more minutes of TV, they're saying like, well, how about 10 minutes, right? And there's kind of this negotiation happening. This doesn't really happen so much on the natural growth side. The children are raised to sort of follow their parents' directives, right, and not to question them because they are the authoritative figures. Okay, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the doctor's office, right, that the high SES kids in the concerted cultivation method are kind of taught to criticize and to intervene on behalf of themselves, right? So if they're, for example, in the classroom and the teacher gives them what they deem an unfair grade, they're going to go to the teacher and say, hey, like, how did I get this grade? I think I deserve better. Versus the natural growth kids who are taught to, of course, sort of oblige the authoritative figures and to trust that they would know better. Okay, so whereas there's sort of the self-advocacy on the side of the concerted cultivation people. There is not so much on the natural growth side. So what are the consequences of this? As we talked a little bit about before, the kids raised under concerted cultivation kind of have this emerging sense of entitlement. So they feel entitled um, to seek their own self-interest, to better their own circumstances, right? Versus the natural growth kids who, because of the way they were reared, don't see the world like that, right? That they're going to go out and advocate for themselves as much as they need, even if that means they're a little bit of a pest, right? They're going to trust that those authoritative figures know what they're doing. Okay. All right. So again, we talked a little bit about this in the context of a doctor's office and what this means for health inequality, but let's take a second to think about what this means for education, right? This means that kids are engaging in their classrooms much differently, right? If you're a child that has been taught to self-advocate for themselves, that has been essentially handed this cultural capital from their parents about how to engage in the world, right? We can think about this as a kind of like embodied cultural capital even. If you've been taught this by your parents, you are going to advocate for yourselves. You're going to seek out opportunities. You're also going to be a child who's been put in like a lot of activities after school, right? Which eventually will go on a resume and help with any kind of application you're submitting, whether that be college or otherwise. This means you're going to have parents who are often probably in contact with your teacher, advocating for you, right? Either saying they're not getting the attention they need in the classroom, or they're not being graded fairly, or maybe even, hey, this kid at school is bullying them. Can you do something about that, right? Versus the natural growth kids who are, under this model allowed to grow and flourish on their own terms, right, rather than being really structured by their parents. The parents are less likely to intervene in the classroom to advocate for the child. The children are more likely to just accept the teacher's word, and even if they're frustrated with it, right, not necessarily seek out self-advocacy in the same way. All right, so already, even at a very young age, we have kids entering these classrooms with very different perspectives on their education, and very different behaviors that ultimately might lead to different outcomes, right? That the kid who can self-advocate, can negotiate a better grade, who's in a lot of after-school activities to bolster their resume, might be more successful down the line than these natural growth kids. And again, I want to just reinforce that this isn't about individual parenting decisions, right? It's not that the natural growth kids are growing up in households where they're not loved or their parents don't care about them. Very much the opposite, right? And there are some advantages to this model, right? You can think about like, if you're an overly scheduled child who's being surveyed by your parents all the time, like that's not always like a positive environment to grow up in. So there are definitely advantages to the natural growth side. But these are conditioned by social class, right? So think about the fact that if you're raised under a concerted cultivation model, you are more likely to raise your kids like that as well. So it's intergenerational. It's not just about how individual parents are choosing to raise their children, but it's about how they were raised themselves. And this is correlated with social class, right? That we see these distinctions emerging depending on your class position within society. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about in terms of how inequality is produced outside of school, specifically in the family. In this next section, we're going to go on and talk about some of the structural causes of inequality, right? And what's happening specifically within schools to produce this as well.